Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's pop-up webinar focused on COVID-19 and Canadian and US immigration. Today we'll be joined by Managing Partner Stephen Green and US Practice Director Tim Golden. I'd like to remind you all that we'll do our best to answer your questions at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to type your questions in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. If we do not get to your question, you can reach out to us by contacting info@gans.com or emailing the contact details provided on screen. Don't forget to follow us on social media and sign up to our alerts where we provide the latest immigration updates and breaking news. And with that, I'll hand things over to our panelists.
Good morning, or just good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well on this Tuesday. So what we're going to talk about on the Canadian side is really, that what the government has proposed. And it's important to understand that the situation is still quite fluid. Things are changing all the time. So always check before you make any type of decision to encounter the border, the airplane, whatever, that everything is still valid as we indicate today. So as far as Canada goes, currently any Canadian citizen who is abroad has the absolute right to come back into Canada at any time. Any permanent resident of Canada that is abroad has the absolute right to come into Canada if they are abroad. This can occur via aircraft, or this can occur by the US-Canada border. With respect to students, the same applies to them. If students have an approved study permit or has applied for a study permit and received their study permit, they are able to enter Canada by air or through the Canada-US border. The same is so with respect to work permit holders. So if you are currently holding a valid work permit, or you've applied and been approved for your work permit, you are able to cross the Canada-US border, or you can board an aircraft and come in that way. The government has also recognized that various Canadians, permanent residents, students, workers, have immediate family members that they wish to accompany them when they enter Canada. And the government has now defined what is an immediate family member. It includes the spouse or common law partner of the person, a dependent child of the person, or the person's spouse or common law partner. And again, remember that the definition of dependent child is anyone under the age of 22. They have expanded immediate family now to include parent or step-parent of the person or person's spouse or common law partner. So now, if you are a Canadian citizen and your parents have a visa to come to Canada, they can join you as part of the immediate family. And finally, they've included a definition of somebody called the guardian or tutor of that person. So if you are a guardian of a Canadian child, then you can enter Canada. And it's important to understand that they do not have to be flying with you or entering with you at the same time. So if I am on a study permit in Canada and my wife has a work permit to accompany me while I'm studying and I am currently in Canada, she will be permitted to enter Canada. So we do not have to travel together. And the government also expanded the situation where if there is a urgent situation where someone should be permitted to come into Canada, then that person can make an application at a Canadian consulate, high commission, or embassy abroad, and the consulate, embassy, or High Commissioner abroad can go ahead and give an authorization for that person to enter Canada. Once a person is permitted to enter Canada, it's important to understand that just like Canadian students, workers, we will all be subject to a 14 self-quarantine days, and you must remain at home for 14 days. So it's important that when you enter Canada, that you have in your mind where you're going to stay for those 14 days. You don't want to be in a situation where you land, for example, at Pearson International Airport and the CBSA officer says to you, okay, you're a student, I'm permitting you to enter. And by the way, you also have to be self-quarantined. What are your plans? Well, if you don't have any plans, then you could run into difficulty with respect to being permitted to enter Canada. And it's important also to understand that it's your obligation to demonstrate to the airline that you are perhaps in a common law relationship if you're flying in, that you are married, and you must have that documentation with you. I guess that, you know, the most difficult one to establish would really be a common law relationship. So if I was on a study permit coming to Canada with my common law spouse, I would bring with me proof that my common law spouse and I have lived together for at least 1 year, proof that we have joint bank accounts together, all of those things, because it is your obligation to make sure that you have the proper documentation to establish that you meet that common law relationship. So that's important that you know that. With respect to any other type of travel, for example, if you were just coming for tourism, you would be denied entry, and that applies to all foreign nationals. We are not permitting any form of tourism into Canada, and that also applies at the Canada-U.S. border for individuals. People that have been approved for permanent resident status and have not landed yet are eligible to, of course, you know, cross the border or fly on the aircraft to come into Canada. They would just need to show the appropriate documentation. Individuals that have not landed, though, and have received their permanent resident status documentation and they are currently in Canada will, at the current time, not be provided with any form of landing interview in person. The department has indicated that they will be making telephone calls to people, and they used to do this under a pilot project about a year and a half ago, and you will answer your various questions and they will attempt to land you by telephone. So it's important to understand that. And with respect to citizenship applications, everything is pretty much on hold right now. There are no citizenship tests. There are no oaths of citizenship. So everyone's citizenship application currently is pretty much on hold. Individuals that are currently waiting for the processing of their documentation, that being, you know, they're waiting for their permanent resident status through the express entry system. Generally, they're given time limits. Those time limits now have been halted so that you will have time to provide the documentation. So for example, you may have been given a letter saying that you must complete your biometrics within 30 days. That 30-day time is no longer valid, and the government is actually giving you up to 90 days to do that because all biometrics inside of Canada are currently closed. Individuals that are anticipating going into the express entry pool, you are aware that you must have all of your documentation ready in case you are invited. So unfortunately, the IELTS centers and CELPIP centers inside of Canada are closed. Therefore, you will not be able to go into the express entry system. Some parts of the world are operating their IELTS center, so you might be able to do that in other parts of the world. But I don't want you to think applications are on hold. They are processing. The government is being extremely flexible with respect to asking for documentation, but until your biometrics are complete, until you're able to complete your medicals, then of course your application will not proceed. Another question that we've been asked a lot about is this postgraduate work permit. In order to obtain a postgraduate work permit, if you are a student inside of Canada, you must be attending in class. The government has waived that requirement, so you are not disadvantaged if your classes have changed to online classes, like most in Ontario and other provinces. So you will not be prohibited from getting your postgrad work permit if your applications are done online. We're going to have to see how it's going to affect the Canada Experience class, because most companies are closed. In Ontario, there's a state of emergency, and people are not permitted to go to work. So we'll have to see how the government's going to deal with the issue of the Canada Experience class. Flag polling. This is a situation where some people receive approvals while they are inside of Canada to get a study permit or to receive a work permit, and they decide to go to the United States border and just turn around and come back. The department is discouraging any type of flag polling, so we do not recommend that anybody go to the US-Canada border and try to obtain their study permit there or their work permit there. All extensions should be done online, and the processing is, is being done as much as they can be done. We also understand that the call centers are not responding to questions at the moment, so it may be frustrating for a lot of people. So as you can see, the government is being very flexible, but understand that the wait times are going to be extended quite significantly. Not as a result of what the government is not doing, it's just they don't have the documentation to process your applications. So we recommend very much that if your work permit is going to expire within the next 6 months, your study permit is going to expire within the next 6 months, you should now go ahead and look at extending those documentation, because it's going to be a very long process to receive the documents. And the same goes with express entry, because as many of you know, express entry was being completed within 6 to 8 months. Now that should be significantly delayed, again, not because of the department, just because they don't have the documentation they need from you, police certificates, medical certificates, those types of things. So I think I've sort of hit all the areas that I wanted to talk about with respect to the Canadian side, and I think I'll turn it over now to Tim, who will tell us how our colleagues are doing in the United States.
Oh, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Building on the same kind of central theme on both sides of the border, essential and non-essential work. Now, I think there have been a lot of carve-outs, as we've seen, sort of things coming through within the last week, and essentially, it's sort of the ultimate is back and forth for tourism and for personal travel. There are continuing to be accommodations for workers, for individuals who have to go into the United States, but that's changing on a daily basis as well. Sort of today's update with the various outlets at the physical border, as well as through pre-flight inspection through the major airports within Canada, is pre-flight inspection. They are still adjudicating the regular TNs and L1s in person. They are not adjudicating waivers in addition to waivers that are done online, and then the requirement of the biometrics and Nexus as well is closed. But if you're flying into the United States and you have a TN or an L1, they will adjudicate it. It's a standard. There's been no guidance on sort of shutting that down in any way. But at the same time, the nuances and the aspects that we've been seeing sort of anecdotally is there has to be urgency to this. So, I mean, if you're flying into the United States Obviously, medical personnel are given the highest of priority, but it's not only to the medical community. So the understanding and sort of the discussion we've had about, as I said, physical and through pre-flight inspection is, and it's not to be sort of coy, but if the business isn't open, then you don't need to be going in for this purpose. And it really will be based on that adjudication, or excuse me, the discretion of that officer to determine, do we need to process this L? Do we need to process this TN? So that you can be going into the United States to actually work. So, sort of the convenience or kind of last dash applications, I think really came to a close last week. Now that was Pearson speaking to that specific. They are open for business, no real restrictions. But when I've talked to various ports through contacts, different takes. But again, the one that I took away from most recently from the discussion is, if they're not open, if it's not essential on the ground within the United States, then we're not going to adjudicate it. Now, NAFTA specialists are still there at the ports. And as a result, they're going to sort of pick and choose which they think are, the applications that they will adjudicate. But, again, if it's an emergency, if there is a need on the ground for an open business within the United States, and you're the only essential person that can do that, then you've got to have your application ready. But I think really it's got to be sort of couched with that additional guidance on, this is the one and only person that can sort of handle this critical situation that we have going down on the ground in the United States. And that again, it's all up to the discretion of the officer. So if you don't have to be in the United States, do not push the boundaries, because they're likely just going to turn you away. Now, speaking to that as well, there's another factor, which particularly along the border with Michigan, we've been advised through those ports that it is a declaration by the state of Michigan of state of emergency that's really dictating that. And that limits the personnel that's going to be able to adjudicate those applications as well. So, the NAFTA specialists on sort of the state by state aren't necessarily going to be there because of state by state or provincial regulations on both sides of the border. So that's another factor that through contacts we've been able to identify. Now, I think the important thing that we've been coming back to, on last week's call as well as this, is really the interplay that is significant for Canadians are the three outlets. Now, the physical border always has been, sort of that great outlet for Canadians to be able to make in-person applications. Now, those restrictions that I just mentioned now really shift you into other areas. Now, Department of State, the consulates, which does, for ease, is something for Canadians that are relevant, but also for, third country nationals that are in Canada. It is, those are, for the foreseeable future, when we see, really through April, are not going to be available. Department of State and visa appointments are really shut down for the foreseeable future. So looking for appointments, trying to get in there. Currently, they're sort of scheduling far out in May, but we don't know when they're going to come back online and what the real sort of focus is going to be for those. But at the same time, it's an encouraging aspect that you can still file these DS-160s online. Set your date, and at least you get your foot in the door, you get yourself in line for whatever it is that we can sort of react to subsequently. But then I think the important thing to identify here is that everything really is coming down on USCIS. So if you're an individual within the United States on a visa, and even if you're a Canadian for a long time now, if you're living within the United States just about a year, you can't be coming up for your extensions under an L. That's a restriction only for commuters and first-time Ls. That's been in place. But now I think that's more important, because what is this urgency? And subjecting yourself to that discretion that I talked about essential personnel. As a result, if you're on the ground within the United States on a TN or an L, you're not coming back to the border. It really should be something that you stay on the ground in the United States, and there is there is a distinct advantage when you're on the ground to file an extension, which is that if you get that extension in before you expire, then there is a 240-day rule which says you have continuing status in that particular status, TN or L, to continue working in that status in the United States while it is adjudicated. Now, USCIS has made some concessions. I mean, that's always been there, but USCIS has made concessions because of the realities of this situation, everybody at home, nobody going into work. Electronic signatures were introduced last week, allowing people to submit applications under an electronic signature for many of the applications, particularly centering around the form I-129. It was always a requirement for a wet signature. They've accommodated that. Their standard now is that you have to get those wet signatures, but they don't have to go into the service centers. So you keep it stowed away should there be sort of an audit check on that, but you can submit based on that electronic signature. That's the good. The bad is premium processing has now been shut down. So those individuals who we thought are essential need to get this through as soon as possible. Premium processing has been suspended. Now that's applicable for both extensions for people within the United States or potentially somebody who's outside the United States like Canada submitting their application and wanting to get an adjudication within 15 calendar days. For both I-129s, which again is the core for most non-immigrant applications, I-140s, which is the green card application, which is limited for premium processing to begin with, all of that has been shut down. So what does that put us in? I mean, again, it pushes us back to this idea that we're on the ground within the United States. You can get your application in, but it's going to sit and pen for what is the standard of about 2 to 5 months for processing through service centers. I really push that to sort of 3 to 6 months. And similar to Stephen's advice, because of this big change, because of premium processing being suspended, our advice is to file as well in advance, 6 to 8 months in advance. So if you've got expirations coming up, based on the current environment, we really should be getting those in. Now, related to that, and these again are through contacts with USCIS, I can't, this is not anything official from USCIS, but officers now are working from home on sort of contingency operations. And as we understand, they're not adjusting the adjudication periods as of now. They're still sticking to what USCIS.gov is quoting as sort of their normal processing times. Now that I think is a big flux, as you know, USCIS workers will start learning the limitations of working from home that we all are currently, and I think that's something that's really going to be something developing within the next week, in the next coming weeks as we sort of see everything USCIS being burdened with all of these applications and potentially really slowing down in those adjudications. But at the border, essential, you really got to keep that in mind. Is it that these individuals have to go in? Is there really something critical? And that's a possibility. But outside of that, then USCIS is really the only sort of outlet that we can look to, and that's really developing on an hourly basis. As I understand, we're pushing up on 1223. We can sort of go back to the format or guidelines. I'm not sure if Evan or Stephen, you want to input anything or introduce the next line of discussion.
What I'd like to, hold on here, unmuted. Okay, one thing that's important, they're talking about not stopping essential business travel, and we at Green and Spiegel have always recommended that anyone prior to the difficulties we're experiencing today, anyone that was coming up here on a business purpose should have something which we call a pocket letter. And basically what that is a letter indicating, hi, my name's Stephen Green. I'm coming up to Canada to have a business meeting and meet with various people. I'm arriving this day, that day. My employer is, funding me for all of this. It's more important now than ever before that people that are coming in as business visitors have some form of pocket letter, because remember again, you have the obligation to demonstrate that you are coming in for a business purpose and that it's an essential purpose. So we just, would make that recommendation to people. Have a pocket letter with you. Number two, people that have received LMIAs, generally an LMIA is valid only for 6 months, meaning that you must file your work permit application prior to the expiry of 6 months after receiving an LMIA. They've now extended that to 9 months. So again, you've got 3 extra months. And lastly, if you are from a visa exempt country and you are applying for your work permit through intra-company transfer at the border, again, remember that you've got to have all the proper documentation to demonstrate that it's an essential reason for you to be in Canada. You're going to be doing this work. And again, you know, all intercompany transfers really should, you know, fall into that area. And as far as we just have a, you know, a couple questions on the PNP, you know, it seems, you know, the PNP is proceeding and moving forward. We're going to have to get clarification as to what's going to happen where the employer has sponsored the particular applicant and now they have, you know, perhaps been laid off. We don't have an answer for that one. And what are some of the other questions? My PR was submitted February 4th. I was told it would take about 6 months. Has this been delayed? Yes, of course it will be delayed because they just don't have the resources, and we'll have to see, you know, if you've completed all the documentation as well. So as Tim has stated on the US side, we're going to say again, file early. Expect everything to be delayed because of what's going on. Question, my son is a Canadian citizen in Toronto. As his parents, can we enter as immediate family members? Yes, you can, for sure, but then you have to understand that you will have to go under self-isolation, and again, have your plan ready. Hi, I'm coming here, my son is a Canadian, I'm coming up, I'm an immediate family member, and I'm going to be self-quarantined for the 14 days. And I think that's about it as far as our questions go. Tim, do you have anything further to add?
No, not really. I just sort of echo what Stephen was saying, which is that, you know, for a business meeting, I would say that you're really identifying what is the critical nature of it. And I go back to, you know, again, the port of entry, which is, you know, if they're not open on that end, then we're not letting you in. I would say that the level of work authorization, a work application is, you know, at a higher level in comparison to, I'm a business visitor, I have to enter in. But at the same time, if you're a business visitor and this critical piece of machinery needs to be looked at or something like that, then that is the type of evidence that you want to be able to identify. And, you know, when talking about a pocket letter, they're often somewhat of a carbon copy. You've got to have the specifics about here's what's going on, here's what's in need to repair, and this is why I have to go in because our U.S. business is really struggling. And those are all the things that you got to be ready to sort of answer. And this essential, non-essential, again, I think it's rather gray when you look at it sort of in a bullet point standpoint from what's been issued. But that's what gives these officers all that discretion. So I have to say, if you don't need to be there, they're going to tell you, then go back home.
It's interesting. You know, I indicated at the beginning of this discussion that Ontario's issued a state of emergency. We know out in British Columbia, you know, they have the same type of thing going on over there. So remember that if you're coming up here for a business meeting and you're going to one of the provinces that there is a state of an emergency, you better make sure that you've got documentation to show that that particular business that you're going to visit is still operating. So again, you've got to look into all of this because the CBSA officer will say, hey, wait a minute, we know that it's an essential service. Okay, we're going to let you in. We know you're going to that business meeting, but wait a minute. We see that you're going to this thing and it's actually not an essential service, so we're going to deny you entry. So it's very important that you have all of that.
Sorry, I'm just addressing one of the questions that we missed in the scroll. Having to go to the U.S. for specific medical issue. Most definitely that is on the list of essential need. I would say always in that situation, you got to have evidence of where you're going, what is the procedure. I would indicate, you know, from your doctors here in Canada, as well as within the United States, advising on the critical need. And that's definitely what they're keeping these borders open for, and sort of primary. You know, speaking to the work authorization, et cetera, they are focusing almost exclusively on the medical community. And that's why they're pushing this off to say medical community first, but obviously the underlying aspect there, patients as well who need medical. But the focus here, as this is a medical crisis, this is something that's obviously right in line with that. That's what they're keeping these borders open for. Still continue to scroll through some of these questions. I think we've hit them on, hit them all. There's a question, Stephen, for U.S. citizen with Canadian PR. Would they be able to enter? Stephen?
Sorry, a U.S. citizen?
Canadian PR, would they be allowed to enter into Canada? I think that's
Yes.
it. That's an answer.
Yes. Yes.
So parents, you got a question. Son is a Canadian citizen living in Canada. As parents, can we enter Canada as members of immediate family in relation to self-isolation? We
Yes.
stay at home. Yeah, I mean, I think you've answered that as well, Steve.
Yeah, I think we've answered most of them.
Okay.
You know, Stephen, is there anything you need to add?
From my end, I don't believe so. I would just like to thank everyone basically for attending today's webinar. I really hope you found it very informative. And Stephen and Tim, I'd like to thank you for sharing your expert advice and taking the time out to speak to everybody today. To all the attendees, just make sure to sign up to our alerts and the link provided to stay up to date with the latest immigration news. And again, if your question was not answered today, just email us at info@gans.com and we will do our best to get back to you. And until next time, everybody, stay safe and thank you for attending.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, everyone. Bye-bye.